So today we are in the land of Elastic Audio. Elastic Audio. So as I mentioned earlier, Elastic Audio is, I think, one of the more powerful features of Pro Tools or any DAW at this point. Just about everything has Elastic Time or some version of Elastic Audio, and we're going to get really into it today. So I'm going to try to get through this in the next hour or so, but it is going to take a minute because we're going to talk about just about everything there is to talk about Elastic Audio. I'm a nut when it comes to this stuff. So because if you do any kind of remixing or you just want to pocket stuff, it can be used just for so many different things. So when I say Elastic Audio, we've all used Elastic Audio already. We talked about it again last week, where we drag stuff in from the workspace and it stretches to fit the tempo of our session. Essentially, Elastic Audio is the track-based version of TCE in Pro Tools. Now, when I say TCE, what am I saying? TCE is time compression expansion. Okay, it's going to let us do time compression expansion on the track in Pro Tools, and we've already used it for some of the stuff. Yeah, we've used it to match a beat to the grid. All right, we do that when you drag something in from the workspace. That's what it does. It conforms to the session tempo. It separates timing from pitch. Well, it's so bizarre that we're used to this. Like when I say separate timing from pitch, you're probably like, well, of course. But think about it. If you take a record, okay, or a tape, and you speed that tape up, or you decide that you want to stretch or compress the time of it, like make it play slower or make it play faster, that also affects the pitch, right? If you speed up a record, not only does it play faster, the tempo increases, but the pitch jumps up, right? If you speed it up twice as fast, the pitch happens to go up an octave, or vice versa. Well, in a DAW, in a computer program, we're used to being able to manipulate time or tempo independent of pitch, right? If I drag an audio file from the workspace and I drop it in and it conforms to the session tempo, it doesn't change the pitch of the audio file I drug in, it just changes the tempo of it. Those two things are not linked anymore when it comes to working with audio on a computer, which is pretty amazing. You can link them, as we'll see when we get into Elastic Time, but typically we don't want to. We want to be able to adjust them independently. Elastic Time is only available on audio tracks. This is not something that has anything to do with MIDI. You can't put it on an aux track. It is only for audio tracks. Okay. And in fact, it's only available in the edit window. So this is not something, most controls in the edit window are available in the mix window, right? Like your fader and your mute and your record button and all that stuff. Automation, for instance. But this is one thing that is only accessible via the edit window. As we see, I'm in the edit window and we'll just look at this one drum loop for starters here. And if I look at my track, I've got again, a lot of stuff that I would see in my edit view, input, output, my track volume. I can click where it says volume, I get a little fader. I click the pan, I get a little pan, mute, solo, all that kind of good stuff. Right here is your Elastic Time selection. The two things that we don't have in the mix window that we have in the edit window are our track time base, which we talked about last week, samples or ticks, and the Elastic Audio plugin. So this is a plugin. It's not an RTAS plugin. It's not a plugin you insert on a track, but it's got a little special slot on every audio track in after Pro Tools 7.4 basically. I think this came out in Pro Tools 7.4. So, and we're going to talk about every last little feature of these here in a sec, but that's how we actually put it on the track if we want it on the track, is right there. All right. Okay. Now I'm going to skip over the first part of this lecture because we talked about track time bases last week fairly in depth. Like I said, just to rehash, if a track is a sample-based track, all right, meaning it is in samples, it is referencing absolute time, like minutes and seconds. Therefore, when you make a tempo change, that track is not affected. So just to rehash one more time, samples-based tracks do not change with tempo changes. They are not affected by a tempo change. Whereas a ticks-based track, if we were to change it to ticks-based, that is a relative time base, which means that when I change tempo, that track is going to be affected. The material on that track, whether it's audio or MIDI or whatever, is going to be altered in some way based on the tempo. And this depends whether Elastic Audio is on the track or not. We talked about it last week. So, but that's going to come back into play here now. Let's see. So I can, just before we dive in here, there's a couple preferences related to Elastic Audio, some of which will make sense and a few of which we'll have to come back to. But you can set Elastic Time up that when you just drag and drop regions off your desktop or a hard drive, that it automatically is placed on the track. So when we drop it from the workspace with that conform to session tempo button on, right, this guy, we talked about last week, this button right here, that it puts the Elastic Audio plugin on the track and goes ahead and conforms to session tempo. Well, I can set it so that every time I import an audio file into Pro Tools, it's going to do that automatically, or at the very least it's going to put the Elastic Audio plugin on. So if I go to the Processing menu under Preferences, so Preferences, Processing, I can have it automatically do that. So for instance, check it out. Drag and drop from desktop conforms to session tempo. I can say all files, and that means when I drop a file in, it's going to use Elastic Time to conform that to the tempo of the session, just like the workspace. If I did a lot of loop-based music, that might be cool. So every drum loop I drop in, it automatically just snaps it to the tempo. I don't have to use the workspace. I guess that would be easier in that respect. And over here, we have just a few basic little Elastic Audio settings. I can enable Elastic Audio on every new track that I make. So when I make a track, Elastic Audio is just automatically on that track. And it will choose one of the Elastic Audio algorithms, which we talked a little bit about, briefly about in another class, but like I said, we're going to hit hard today. Again, these all do time stretching. They're just optimized for different audio materials. So a monophonic audio file as opposed to drums, as opposed to, so on and so forth. And then input gain we'll have to come back to. We'll come back to that because we got to talk about Elastic Time before that's going to make sense. It'll turn down the level of your audio when you bring it in by a certain setting that you choose, which, like, why would you want that? Well, we'll see. Okay. And then I can also have my tracks, if I really want to, default to a TIX time base. So even my audio tracks, I can have default to TIX. And you're like, well, why would I want that? Well, think about it. If we combined these two features together, let's say you were doing a lot of dance music, for instance. If I go to Processing and I say, hey, every file that I drag in, I want it to conform to the tempo of my session. All right? And every track that I make, I want to have Elastic Audio on that track. So I'm using Elastic Audio all over the place. And then I go to Editing menu, and I say, hey, all my tracks default to a new TIC time base. If I were to select all of those, think about what's going to happen. Every audio file that I drag in is going to lock to my session tempo and be a TIX-based track. And what that means is I can then change the tempo of my session, and all the audio will stretch or expand, will compress or expand to fit that new tempo. So essentially, my audio is like Play-Doh now that I can kind of move around and change and try out new tempos and do all sorts of stuff without having to set anything, without having to put it in a TIX-based track, without having to put Elastic Audio on the track. It just becomes kind of very easy to remix and try different tempos. So if you were working on music where that was relevant, you may actually want to go ahead and do that stuff. Now I'm going to turn that off because I don't want that to happen with the way that I work. I usually want to do that on a track-by-track basis, not globally for my entire session. But it's an option. All right. Oh, so we put the Elastic Audio plugin on the track. Okay, so we know essentially what Elastic Audio does is that it allows us to time stretch, compress, or expand audio. All right. Well, that takes processing power. If the computer, because we're used to it happening in real time. In other words, if I go over to a region and I time stretch it, it's not writing a new audio file on my hard drive. Pro Tools is actually rendering that time stretching as it plays over the region. Okay. That's pretty impressive. And if you have a lot of tracks, your computer may not be able to do that. It may not be able to, in real time, render all the very complicated math that's going on while it's doing that time stretching. Particularly for things like the monophonic algorithm, as we'll see. That one is very, very processor intensive. So your computer will crap out on you relatively quickly if you're dealing with, 16 tracks of drums and you're trying to pocket them all using real-time audio, Elastic Audio processing. So real-time is immediate. Awesome, you make a change, you hear it immediately, just like real-time plugins, RTAS plugins, but it's more demanding on your system. They don't have to be real-time, as we'll see. I can tell Elastic Audio to render. What that means is, every time I make a change, every time I time stretch even a little bit, it takes a second, and it renders a new audio file on your hard drive. And then it plays that rendered file back. So it's not trying to time stretch in real time. It's going to go to your hard drive and access the rendered version of the audio file. So it's less intensive on your computer. And if you've ever looked at your Pro Tools session folder, you've seen a folder called the Render Files folder, and that's what that folder is for. It's for rendered Elastic Audio processing. So for most of us, you go to that folder and there's never anything in it. Well, if you're not using rendered Elastic Audio processing, there won't be anything in it, okay? And those are typically temporary files. But let's check it out. So let's look at a track. And I'll go ahead and put Elastic Audio on this track. And this is a drum loop. So if I was going to time stretch this, I might choose Rhythmic, because Rhythmic is the algorithm that supposedly, and it usually does, sounds better on drums. Get rid of this fade here. And now, if we click on this again, hide this, we'll talk about this little window here later. So if I don't click where it says Rhythmic, but I click on the little picture of this little, that's a picture of a warp marker, but it looks like a little marker right there, a little flag. We can choose whether we want this track to have real-time processing, in other words, live time stretching in real time, or we want to have rendered time stretching. All right. So again, rendered, when you make a change, you have to sit around and wait for a minute as it renders it out. It just depends on what your computer can handle. All right. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into Xform, which is a rendered only algorithm. But just realize real time happens in real time. Rendered is not. That's not the case. All right. So here's how we can use Elastic Audio in Pro Tools. Okay, so real-time Elastic Audio processing or rendered processing can be applied by 4 different things in Pro Tools. One of which we already know about, and that's the Conform to Session Tempo button in the workspace. We've done that a million times. Okay. So some of the other ways, and I'm going to skip around on these guys. We're going to jump to number 4 here. Using the TCE trimmer. All right, what is the TCE trimmer? If I go back over to Pro Tools, we have a trim tool. Everyone's used the trim tool. We know the trim tool. We love it, right? The trim tool just shows or hides portions of a region. That's all it does, right? But we have different versions of the trim tool, right? So if I click and hold with my mouse, we actually have 3 different trim tools that we can make use of in Pro Tools. One of which is the loop trimmer, which I think I mentioned in one of the first videos that I gave you guys at the beginning of the quarter, but just to show it to you, if I use the loop trimmer, if I hover my mouse on the bottom of the region, it's still just the regular old trim tool. So this one's actually kind of cool because it does 2 things. If I hover my mouse on the top, you see that I get a little picture of the trim tool, but with like a little loop symbol. So now when I trim, it's just going to loop out the regions. So it's kind of like, it's like using the loop command in Pro Tools. I can loop this out as many times as I want. And that's all it does. So it's not showing or hiding any new portion of the region. It's taking what you were looking at and looping it out. Whatever. Not related to Elastic Audio at all, just the way that it works. But this other one is. Oh, I'm sorry, Fifi. That was the loop trim tool. So the standard trim tool just is the one we're all used to using, where it just shows or hides a portion of a region. The loop one will loop out the region. So it'll take what you're looking at, or the region, and it will let you loop it as many times as you want as you're trimming it out. So it makes new copy. Essentially, is making new copies of the region. Kind of, but yeah. So that's all it does. It loops. And then the other loop tool is the TCE loop tool. Now, if you're running a Pro Tools HD system, you have a few other options here. So you're at least one other option, which is the scrub trimmer, but we don't have that. I don't have that. So the TCE tool. TCE, again, stands for time compression expansion. So what's going to happen here is it's not going to show or hide the portions of the region. So when I trim now, it is not going to hide or reveal a new portion of this region. It's going to time stretch. It's going to compress or expand it depending on which way I drag. If I drag to the left, it's going to compress it, right, and make the transients closer together, this drum loop. If I drag it to the right, I trim to the right, it's going to expand it, make the transients farther apart. Essentially, I'm changing the tempo with a file. I can either speed it up or slow it down. Well, watch this. I'm going to take Elastic Audio off this track just to show you how this typically works as a review. I know some of you guys have used this before. If you just select the TCE trimmer in Pro Tools and you trim, so I'm going to make this drum loop faster. I'll just trim it like this. It's going to happen really quick, but watch what happens when I let go. It's going to render a new file. Real quickly, it pulled up a little dialog that said, hey, it was rendering a time shift region. This is a new region in my regions list and a new audio file on my hard drive. So when you use the TCE trim tool in Pro Tools and you adjust the timing of something, it renders a brand new audio file. It's taking up space on your hard drive. It's in your audio files folder. And it lets us know what we did. It says 70s ballad drums, TISH, time stretch. That's how you know you use this tool. Okay? And if I went over to my regions list, which we might as well do here, let me move this out the way, I will see there's the 70s ballad drums file, which was the original file that I just trimmed. And then there's our new version of that, which is the time stretch version. Okay, that is a rendered process. That is not a real-time thing. It's rendering a new file to my hard drive, and that's what's being played back. Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to undo that because I don't want that time stretching to have occurred. Let's put Elastic Audio back on. Let's see what happens. This functionality changes when we put Elastic Audio on a track. So I'll go Rhythmic again here. And we'll choose our time stretch tool. Now remember, Elastic Audio is in real-time mode. So it's set. When any time stretching occurs, it's going to happen in real time. It's not going to render a file to my hard drive now. So now when I time stretch this, and I let go, it's not making a new region in my regions list. It's not putting a new audio file in my audio files folder. It's happening in real time. When I hit play, Pro Tools is going to play this time stretching back and calculate it on the fly. Again, cool, also processor intensive. And again, I can just move this around wherever I want. I don't have to wait for it to render. That's kind of cool. I'm going to undo that. If I were to choose rendered processing, so now I'm going to tell Elastic Audio to work as a rendered process, not a real-time process. I'm stretching this guy around. It's probably hard for you to see, but when I let go, the file's going to turn gray. And it's going to take a second before it gets colored again. So here, I'm going to let go, and you can see it's gray right now, right? That's because this is not a real-time process. Pro Tools has to render this time stretch out. It puts that rendered file into your renders files folder on your hard drive. You can see how it took a second to come back. It's calculating it. We have a rendered file. Now when I hit play, it's playing that rendered file. It's not hogging my computer resources. All right, I digress, but it's an important point. Okay. Back to where we were here. So that's using the TCE trimmer tool. You can use it with or without Elastic Audio on the track. Without Elastic Audio on the track, it prints a new region in your regions list, prints a new hard drive, or prints a new audio file on your hard drive. With Elastic Time on the track, it's done in real time, or it's going to render a rendered file in your rendered files folder. All right, so other ways. We'll come to quantizing. We're going to talk about something that's really cool today when we get to quantizing, but let's look at editing. I want to talk about manually manipulating Elastic Time, because you end up doing that more often than not, and that's where the real power of this comes in. We already talked about conform to session tempo. We already talked about TCE trimmer. And I'm going to save, I think I'm going to save quantizing for later. So I really want to get into what Elastic Audio is actually doing behind the scenes, because once we know, we can then leverage the real power of it. So what's actually happening when you put a plugin on a track? Well, what Elastic Time does is it goes through the audio region and it searches for what it calls transient events. Okay, it's looking for transients within the region, and it's going to put what are called event markers or transient event markers in front of them. It's very similar to Beat Detective. Hopefully, you guys watched the multi-platinum videos where Brady was using Beat Detective, so you already know what Beat Detective is, because I'm not going to get into that today. But it's similar to Beat Detective, where it just is marking the beginning of transients. So let's take a look at that. And there's a particular view that I'm about to go look at. And we're going to go look at analysis view. So when you put the Elastic Audio plugin on a track in Pro Tools, this is important, you get two new viewing options for the track. So let's go look. I'll take it off. So let's start from scratch here. And I'm going to click on my track view selector. Now this is where we normally get to see volume and mute automation, and do we want to look at our playlists, right? We've all done that when we've been editing and comping this quarter. Well, you notice that there's two that are grayed out, and one's called analysis and one's called warp. These are specific views just for the Elastic Audio plugin. So the only time they become available is once we put that plugin on the track. And the first one we're going to deal with is analysis view. So I'm going to put the plugin back on the track. I'm going to choose Rhythmic again. Now I come back to my track view selector, and there we go. Now we can choose warp view or analysis view. And we'll look at analysis view, because this is really going to show us how the Elastic Audio plugin is analyzing the track. So we go to analysis view. And now, by the way, just because we're key command junkies, or I am, and I'm trying to make you be one, I can switch between my track views by holding down Control, Command, and using the left and the right arrow. So I can really quickly, the way that I go to Elastic Time when I use it is I just go Control, Command, and I hit the left arrow twice, and I'm immediately into analysis view, right? Because I started in waveform. If I were to hit Control, Command, and hit the left arrow once, I'd go to warp, hit it twice, I go to analysis, hit it 3 times, I go to playlist. You can move around really quickly without having to mess with your mouse. So again, I'll go back to Warp View here. And here are those event markers I was just talking about. You see, here's my drum region here. And in between every drum transient, there is a little line. And that is Pro Tools guessing that that is a transient. It's marking that transient in the track. All right? That's going to be something that we can eventually time stretch. Now, Pro Tools does a pretty good job, I will say, of detecting transients. And again, that's what Analysis View is for. It's for now I can edit those. So sometimes Pro Tools doesn't do a good job. Well, in this case, it's drums. How hard is it for Pro Tools to detect transients in a drum track? It's not very hard. But what happens if we had like an ambient pad that doesn't really have, where the notes don't really have, really defined beginnings and endings? Pro Tools may not be able to do anything with that. Or a vocal, okay? If you want to do a lot of stuff where I'll take a cappella vocals from that artists will send me and manipulate them and put them over other music. Well, I have to go through and do a lot of time stretching, and Pro Tools doesn't do a very good job of detecting transients in a vocal. So I may need to go manually manipulate these, is what I'm saying. So these event markers, Pro Tools puts them in automatically, but you can absolutely move them, and sometimes you have to. So I want to look at how to actually do that. So when Pro Tools detects these event markers, it detects them with a certain degree of confidence. So it is more confident about some of those transients actually being transients than it is of others, if that makes any sense. And it keeps track of that. So it actually rates, you can't see this rating, but it has rated all of those markers, and it's sure that some of them are transients and other ones it's not really so sure. So we have, just like in Beat Detective, again, hopefully we know what's going on with Beat Detective, a sensitivity slider that we can drag that is going to get rid of some of those events that Pro Tools is less confident about. It's going to keep the ones that Pro Tools is really sure are transients, but the ones that it's unsure of, it'll kind of get rid of them and move them out the way. So we'll see how that works. So this is the easiest way to change the way that Pro Tools detects these events. And you do that using the Elastic Properties menu, okay? And you get to that from the Regions list. The Regions menu, my bad. So if I go to Region Elastic Properties, if I'm talking too fast, please yell at me. It's option 5, okay? Yeah, if I'm talking too fast, yell. And Fifi just yelled. I'm going to slow down. I need to slow. I get very excited about this stuff. I want to just, talk at Mach 5 because I'm a nerd. Okay, so good. Fifi, but continue to yell at me if I speed up again. Should not drink coffee before I do these lectures. Nice. Oh, nice. You're recording it. Cool. Okay, so Elastic Properties. So this Elastic Properties window, essentially what it's going to do, you notice, now this is confusing at first because I go, let's say Region Elastic Properties. Well, think about it. This is under the Regions menu. All right? The Region menu lets me manipulate something about a region. So this Elastic Properties dialog is region specific, meaning if I click, nothing is going to show in it until I click on a region. And if I click on another region, I'm going to have different options in the Elastic Properties window. It's pretty cool. So right now, you notice what it's telling me. Hey, no Elastic Audio regions are selected. In other words, there's nothing that this window can show me. I haven't made a selection. If I select a little piece of this region, it still doesn't have anything there. It is only going to show me something when I select an entire region. Okay, so I'm going to triple click, and select all of this drums region, and now you see that the Elastic Properties window populates. So again, it is a region-specific dialog in Pro Tools. There's not many of those, but this is one of them. And so we can set different regions up. We can kind of configure them differently for Elastic Audio to optimize it properly for the different regions in our session. Now, okay, well, let's look at what options we get. This is a samples-based track. You see, and that is very important. You see where it says region, and it gives us a little picture of the samples time base. As we'll see, when we choose a TIX time base, this is going to give us some other options. It actually expands to show us a lot more, but we're samples-based for now. It's all good. All I care about showing you right now is this event sensitivity dialog box. So this is how, if Pro Tools detected too many transients, and right now it actually did a pretty good job of really detecting just the transients at the beginning of the drum hits. But like I said, that's pretty easy. It's a drum file. We're going to pretend, though, that it detected too many. And let's say that some of these little small transients, like right here, that we don't want Pro Tools to detect that. Let's say that's noise and not really a hi-hat, which it is, but again, we're pretending. Watch what happens as I drag event sensitivity down. Pro Tools is going to start to remove some of those transient events. It is less confident about those really quiet transients actually being transients than it is about the ones that are very loud. And now it's using amplitude, it's using the frequency content, it's judging what's a transient by a number of methods. But ultimately, the quiet ones are the ones that are going to get dumped first. So I can actually use this slider and get rid of all of them if I go down to 0%. But yeah, that's kind of like Melodyne. Sure. That's a good way to look at that. Again, really similar to Beat Detective. Really similar to Beat Detective, where it's the same idea where you can determine what transients you want to actually separate in Beat Detective. But yeah, sure. So sensitivity slider, I pull it down, less sensitive, more sensitive. Now in this case, obviously 100% is going to be fine. It's not adding a bunch of weirdo transients in here. But if it did, if we were looking at something where there was a bunch of extra markers in here, I might actually want to make use of that. Okay, so that is and we'll see more about that because I'm going to do an example of this later on today, where we'll need to make that happen. Okay, well, one issue that you run into, and this is another issue directly related to Beat Detective, and maybe let's pull up an example right now while I'm talking about this because I don't want to forget to come back to this. I've got a recording of a drum kit in this session, and it's a terrible recording, to be honest with you, but it's just kick, snare, and hi-hat. And let's see, yeah, this will be a good example of this. And I've already got Elastic Audio on these tracks. I've got them grouped together, okay? You can see that it's detected the transients in these drums, right? It's got, okay, it's picking up transients on each track. It's what we expect. But notice it's got some things like this. You see how it's detected, it's put a transient event where there really isn't any transient. Right? There's not anything really going on there that I want to time stretch. Here's another one. I don't really see a reason that should be there, other than it's kind of sitting in the middle of the decay of my hi-hat, which is probably not going to bode well for me when I do my time stretching. And there's a few of these. So this would be a case where I would need to get rid of some of these events. Now I can manually go delete them. Okay, I can hold down Option and delete them. I don't want to do that. I'm going to use my event sensitivity slider. So watch what happens as I pull it down. I call it a slider. It's really just a dialogue, but whatever. It's a slider in Beat Detective. That's why I call it that. As I pull this down, it's going to remove those that it's less confident about, and you'll start to see those guys kind of go away. All right. So now it's really only detecting transients right at the beginning of actual transients. None of those kind of ghosted ones are in there. But oh crap! Look what happened. I got rid of the ones I didn't want, but it also got rid of some of the ones I did want. It got rid of this one here. Well, I don't want that. Like, I'd like to keep that one, but be able to get rid of all those other ones. But if I pull it down low enough to get rid of the other ones, then I lose that transient. That's a problem. It's a problem in Beat Detective too. When you're talking about transient detection, as you take the sensitivity down, you're going to get rid of stuff you don't want, but you might also get rid of stuff you do want. And that leads us to this concept. This is also the exact same way that Beat Detective works. I know I keep saying that, but there's a lot of similarities between Elastic Time or Elastic Audio and Beat Detective. I can promote a transient event marker so that it stays even when I take the sensitivity down. I hate the term promote. I wish they used a different term. In other programs, they'll use the term like lock. I really like the term lock. So let's pretend that promote is called lock, where I can lock one of these guys down. I can pick a transient event and lock it in place so that when I drag my sensitivity slider, that event is not affected. Okay, they call it promoting, but whatever. You're promoting its importance. So it's now Pro Tools is now going to be really confident that that event is a transient and it's not going to get rid of it for you. I'll show you. It's really simple. I'll show you how it works. I'm going to take my sensitivity back up because we're saying that we want to keep this one guy right here, and it's kind of getting pulled out when I take my sensitivity slider. So let's promote it. The way I'm going to zoom in here. The way that we promote a marker to do Elastic Audio is just by clicking on it. And I don't like this either because there's no visual indication that you've promoted it. It drives me nuts. Like in a program like Recycle, there's a little lock that appears above the transient when you do that. I wish it denoted this in some ways, but watch what happens. I'm going to just click on it one time. I clicked on it. No visible change whatsoever. But watch what happens when I drag my event sensitivity down now. So I'll promote this guy now just by, as I said before, I promise you it works by clicking on it. I click on him, select everything. Okay? Notice what happened. I took my sensitivity all the way down to 0. There is not a single event marked in this track anymore, except for that one. Okay? So I promoted it. It's locked now. Pro Tools is super confident to the point where it's not even going to let me get rid of it unless I actually go hold down Option, click on it, and delete it. So there you go. That's the concept of promoting. If you're dealing with drums, you might have to do that a little bit. If you're dealing with bass, or like I said, a pad or something that's got not defined transients, you're probably really going to have to do that. If not, just do it manually from the outset. So, all right, so that's like kind of the automatic way to do this. We're hoping the sensitivity slider is going to help us out. Well, let's see how to manually deal with this. This is really simple. Because sometimes, and I'll be honest with you, it's fairly rare that I have to go in and manually adjust analysis markers. Pro Tools does, like I said, a good job. But we'll go back to analysis view. You can move these around. So you can just grab them and move them. So let's say that for whatever reason, Pro Tools detected a transient right here. And I look at this and I'm like, no, that's not really right, Pro Tools. You should have had this transient be right at the beginning. You could just click and drag and move it, okay? Very simple. I said if I hold down Option, one of the things that Option does in Pro Tools is it lets us delete things, like markers. If I hold down Option and click on a marker, it's going to delete the marker. If I hold down Option and I click on a marker, you see how it says remove this marker? Nice little handy command. I can get rid of it. I can also just double click on it and it'll get rid of it too. So there's there's 10 ways to do everything. So Pro Tools is pretty nice. If you hover your mouse, it'll let you know, hey, if you just hover your mouse over this, you can reposition it now, so on and so forth. I can add a new marker. So let's say right here that this is supposed to be a transient, and for whatever reason, Elastic Time just isn't picking that up. It's not analyzing that as a transient. If I double click, it'll add it. So double clicking deletes and double clicking adds. I could also Option click to delete or Control click to add if you really want to know that. Those key commands are really good for markers and things like that, but for these event things, double clicking works, which is pretty handy. So there you go. Move them around, add them, delete them, depending on the material you're dealing with. All right. Moving ahead here. So that's analysis view. Now let's take a second here and really look more at that elastic properties window. I want to make sure that we're cool with some of the other things going on in there. Jump back to it and get it back open here. So we talked about event sensitivity. Now, there's not many other options in here. One of which, though, is input gain, and we saw that input gain thing in the preferences. If you remember, when we drag an audio file in, it could put elastic time on the track automatically for us and set the input gain, so it would actually turn the track down. Which, again, why would you want to do that? Well, one of the things that happens when you use elastic audio is that you can potentially clip, okay? So if we brought in a region that was already right up at near 0 dB and you time stretch it, that will cause the file to attempt to cross 0 and it will clip. So elastic time can cause clipping, all right? If the file's already really loud. If it's not, don't worry about it. But if there's transients that are right up at 0, you're going to push them beyond that. So on the Elastic Properties plugin, you have the ability to turn the region down. And look at the waveform. The waveform, this actually turns up and turns down as I move this. You can see it visually. So if that's happening, you'll know that it's happening because the region will have a little red mark on it. If Elastic Audio is going to cause your region to clip, it gives you a visual indication on the far right side of the region, right underneath the little picture of the marker. It's letting you know that elastic time is on this region because it's got that little marker on it. Well, a little red dot will show up there, little red box. And if that were to happen, that's just letting you know, hey, you need to come over to your input gain and back this guy down so that you don't get digital clipping going on. That's rare. Okay, I really don't have that happen very often, but something to be aware of. That's why the input gain exists. This input gain, by the way, just as kind of an aside, was one way to do kind of clip-based gain before clip-based gain exists. I used to stick elastic audio on all my tracks, and this would give me like a 6 dB, the ability to cut regions by 6 dB, which is the only way to do it other than using the Audio Suite plugin. But now we have clip-based gain in Pro Tools 10, and everyone's happy. Whatever. Pitch shift, we'll come back to pitch shift, but you can use this elastic time, this is new, to pitch shift regions. Hold that thought on that. It has nothing to do with time stretching whatsoever, so we're going to get back to that guy. Okay, so this elastic properties box, as I mentioned earlier, is going to look different for a samples-based track than for a ticks-based track. So we see that there's very few options in here right now, but watch what happens when I change this track to a ticks-based. Now you see it says region in the elastic properties window, and it has a little picture that lets me know that this is a samples-based track. Well, I'm now going to change that. Okay, elastic properties just changed. It's saying, hey, now this is a ticks-based track. It's a region on a ticks-based track. It has the little picture of the metronome, which denotes that it's ticks. And now look what we have. We still got input gain, right? That didn't change. But now we've got a few other options. It's telling me how long this file is. It's guessing what the tempo of the file is. So it actually is Elastic Audio is analyzing this file, not just for the transients, but it's also determining the tempo of the file. It's saying, hey, this loop is at 140 beats per minute. Now, that's irrespective of the tempo of my Pro Tools session. It's letting me know that this file is a 140 beat per minute file, and that it's in 4/4, all right? Which is cool. You don't typically need to come change this unless you know that it's not true, okay? So if you know that this file is not at 140 beats per minute, you can come type in the actual tempo of the file that will make it play back properly. Or if you know exactly how long the file is and you're like, no, this file isn't this long, Pro Tools is off base on that, you can change it. It's only if Pro Tools analyzes the file improperly, okay? One of the mistakes that Pro Tools will make, and not just Pro Tools, but all programs that have Elastic Time, Ableton Live, this whole concept of Elastic Time kind of came from Ableton Live. The whole concept of warping and all that stuff, that's even the terminology they use. So Pro Tools kind of ripped that off a little bit, but whatever, every program has it now. But the mistake that this software like this makes when it's analyzing an audio file for tempo is it will often analyze it either twice as fast as it actually is or half as fast as it actually is. It's just one of those things, and it's rare, but it does happen. And that's what these little half and ×2 buttons are. If Pro Tools analyzes this file at the wrong tempo, let's say that the file is actually at 70 beats per minute and Pro Tools just screwed up and analyzed it at 140. Instead of typing in 140, I can just hit the half button and it will set it to 70, okay? And you notice it actually changes the length of the file because it's a ticks-based track. It'll make the file actually play faster. So it's actually not, it's basically undoing, if it had detected at 140, it would be playing it way stretched out if it was a 70 beats per minute file. So if you have an issue like that, you can click those buttons, whatever. It's also a handy way if you have a drum loop and you want to make it twice as fast or twice as long, you can just press those buttons and it'll do that for you really quickly. Not going to spend a ton of time on that, strictly because you don't have to deal with that a whole lot. Pro Tools is pretty good about it. But if something is ever playing back twice as fast or half as fast, those buttons will fix that. Now, something else. This is important. Most times when you deal with loop-based music or you're dealing with Elastic Time, you're probably dealing in 4/4. But if that's not the case, if you're in 3/4, if you're in 7/4, particularly if you're in 6/8 or something like that, a compound time signature, you need to know Pro Tools actually is not analyzing the audio file to figure out what its meter is. It just defaults to always being in 4/4. So it analyzes and figures the tempo out on every region, but it's just always going to say 4/4. So I could load up a region in here that's in 6/8, and Pro Tools is not going to have any way of detecting that. You have to actually manually enter that in. So if you're working with regions, a session that's not at 4/4, make sure that you actually you go in and tell Pro Tools, you type it in here and you say 6/8, so it analyzes it properly, or whatever your time signature is. That's pretty rare, all right? So I'm letting you know that because it's the way that it works, but I sincerely doubt you're going to run across that every day of the week. And that's the different view for ticks versus sample-based tracks. So that Elastic Properties window gives us different options. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to get onto the really cool part of this. So far, this is like, it's like, okay, great. We've got Elastic Audio is detecting transients. It can make a file longer, shorter, double the tempo, half the tempo. Okay, wonderful. This analysis view that we've been using doesn't actually let us do anything, okay? The analysis view, let me get off of Elastic Properties, just lets me define where transients are within the file, but I'm not actually manipulating what the file sounds like in this view. I can't. I'm just moving these little markers around. It's not changing what the audio sounds like. It's just, you know, again, letting Pro Tools know where the transients are, making sure that it did a good job of that. The other view that we're going to look at is where we actually get to manipulate the audio. And this is the fun part. The other view is called Warp View, and that's the view that I was in mistakenly a minute ago when I was trying to promote my, transient event marker, and I couldn't do it. It's because I wasn't in analysis view. I was in Warp View. So Warp is going to let us, now we're going to get to pin those little transient markers down and move them around, and it's going to actually time stretch the audio. And so instead of just moving them around to figure out where the transient is, now it's going to pin it right at the transient and stretch, which is pretty cool. So it's where we're actually going to get to change what the audio sounds like via time compression or expansion, depending on which way we want to go with this. So let's look at Warp View. I'll go back here. I'm going to put myself in Warp View. I'll just go Control, Command, and I'll hit the right arrow because I know that just from using this a lot that Warp is right under Analysis View. So I know that if I hit the right arrow, I'm going to be right into Warp View very quickly. Which is awesome. So now watch what happens when I click on these, what were formerly just kind of our transient event markers. When I click on a marker, double click on a marker, excuse me, we get this new kind of looking bar here with a little blue triangle at the bottom. You notice that little blue triangle with the kind of the, line coming out of it is the same picture that we see on the Elastic Audio plugin. If we go look at the plugin, it's got that little triangle with a little bar coming up from it. What we've just done is turned our analysis event marker, our transient event marker, into what's called a warp marker. Okay? Warp markers are markers that you can drag and time stretch from. All right? That's why it's called Warp View. We're going to warp the audio or change the audio. And again, a term used in Ableton Live for years and years and years and years that is now used in Pro Tools. So, yeah, we're going to see what we can actually do with these warp marker guys. It's going to actually anchor the audio event to the timeline, right? Which I know I just said, but so check it out. I've got this warp marker here. Actually, let me make sure I'm not skipping anything. There we go. So how do we make a new warp marker? Well, I just did it. I just double-clicked right on one of those events and defined a warp marker right there. I can also add one anywhere that I want by control clicking. So if there's one that I want to add that there's not an event marker already there for, I can just add it quickly. So let's see here. So I added this one just by double clicking. I could add one here by double clicking. Could add one here by double clicking. I could control click and add one randomly right there if I needed to. So in other words, if I realize, oh man, I really need to time stretch that spot and there's not an event marker there, whatever, I can just add my own warp marker very quickly and easily. So what does it do when I drag these guys? What is it going to look like? Well, I'll give you one example here. Watch what happens when I drag this particular warp marker around. Okay? Essentially what this does, let's see what Fifi says. So you can drag with control and not warp, or drag with no buttons in warp. So, oh, did you read that from the other screen? Let's see, because I haven't talked about that yet. Yeah, hold on this one. We'll get to this bottom guy in a minute. Yes, you're right. That's what you just said is exactly correct. No, don't be sorry. And again, you read it perfectly. To add a marker, yeah, again, all good, please. I just double click and it adds it in. Again, or I said you could control click and it will add one in. Watch what happens when I drag. What warping does, the analogy I like to use is that it basically turns the audio region into a rubber band, okay? Where you can just basically grab pieces of it and move it around. We don't have to cut the region up anymore. We don't have to use fades because we've made slices in the region or anything like that. It just lets us take an audio transient and move it wherever we want, and it's time stretching. In this case, if I take this transient and I move it to the right, it's expanding the left side and it's compressing the right side. So it's making the left side longer and it's making the right side shorter. And it's pretty transparent. You can actually go pretty far with this, and we'll see exactly how far here in a bit, without a tremendous amount of artifacting. That's why it's so freaking useful. And it makes things like comping. I comp using elastic time because it's so fast. Instead of chopping things up and moving them, it's gotten to the point where it sounds good and it's very quick. But we'll get back to that. But I can add these markers again by double-clicking or by control-clicking. I can remove them. So if I've got ones that I've put in there and I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound right, I move the transient to some place I didn't want it to go. Here's where that option click is going to work. So I can option click a warp marker, and not only is it going to take the marker out, but it's going to move the transient back to where it originally was. Okay, it's going to undo the warping or the movement of the point within the audio region. So here's a good example. I'll take this file and I'll move it over here. I'll take this transient, I'll warp it over here. Okay, we decide that didn't sound very good. If I want to get it back to where it was originally, I'll hold down Option. And when I hold down Option, you see that my mouse turns into a little pointer with like a minus sign, meaning it's going to subtract this warp marker and get rid of it. And if I click, it goes away, and the audio goes back to exactly where it was originally. So I've just kind of undone that, deleted that warp marker. You're going to need to do that. You're going to warp stuff and be like, oh, some of it's going to work, some of it's not going to work. When we quantize, it's going to get some of it right and some of it's not going to be right. You'll have to kind of take out the ones that are funky. Okay. And then this is the one Fifi was mentioning a minute ago. I can relocate a warp marker. So in other words, I can move it. Basically, it's almost like picking it up and moving it and putting it down somewhere else where it's not time stretching the audio. So it just lets me move it to a new location is what it does. And the control key command allows you to do that. So if it's not sitting right on a transient and maybe it's not close enough to the transient, I just want to get it a little closer because, again, it's what's going to let me stretch that transient. I can hold down Control. So here's a good example of that. Let's pretend here that I need to, this is a warp marker that I've got right here. And I just want to move it if I normally move it, it's going to time stretch. Now, I don't want that to happen. I just want to be able to kind of pick it up and scoot it over a bit and drop it right there, let go of Control, and now I can go back to time stretching, okay? So to relocate a warp marker, Control will allow you to kind of pick it up and move it around, which is nice. I don't use that a whole lot because usually, because of Analysis View, our events have been detected properly and we can just pin them down and go. But if you need to move one, you can certainly do that. More probably relevant for when you're doing things like pads, vocals, bass, things that don't have maybe as defined a transients as drums. But it's easiest to teach this on drums because you can see the transients very easily. Okay, we're getting there. Now let's talk about the 3 different ways to apply Elastic Audio. There are 3 different methods to using Elastic Audio in Pro Tools as far as manually editing, like me going in and moving the warp markers around. And they have definitive names that Pro Tools Avid has given them, and there's certain symbols that we're going to see that pop up that denote which one of these editing features we're using. And the first one I want to talk about is called Telescope Warp. Okay, so the telescoping warp. And this one is probably most useful, as it says here, for taking an audio region and adjusting it to match the session tempo, right? Which is kind of what the workspace does, right? But if I need to go through a file and pin certain beats in the file down to the grid, this is a really good way to do that, particularly with files that maybe weren't recorded to a click and aren't going to, the workspace isn't going to be able to pin down for us. Let's go ahead and look. See what it looks like, and I'll come back to the screen here in a minute. What I'm about to do is move through the region, and I'm going to add warp markers at transients and then drag those transients to sit on the grid where I think they should. So beat 2 in this drum region, I'm going to try to move to beat 2 on the grid so that it plays back along with the tempo and the click track. So let's look at this. So I got this drum loop. Turn off my click track here, and I don't have I'm back on the laptop today, so I cannot hit 7 on the numeric keypad to turn off my clicks. I'll just come up here and do it. Turn this up. Okay, so I'm listening to this this drum pattern. And of course, the first transient right there is the 1. That's the beginning. That makes sense. But this guy right here is beat 2 within the region. Okay, so that is the second beat. So beat 1 is this first guy. Here's beat 2. Well, that does not sit on the grid in Pro Tools at beat 2. Where's beat 2 in Pro Tools? Beat 2 in Pro Tools is right here. Look at the grid. You see where it says beat 2? So if I want to conform this file to fit with my session tempo, okay, I need to somehow drag the beat 2 of the region to snap it to the grid, right? And that's one of the things that telescoping warp is going to do. And I'll zoom out so you can really kind of see what this looks like. What I'm going to do is go ahead and double click and stick a warp marker right there. And I want to check on a couple of things here, make sure we're good. Okay, there you go. When I hover my mouse over beat 2, it says telescoping warp. It's letting me know that what I'm about to do is this thing called a telescope warp. And you'll see why it's called telescope. It's a visual thing, that the reason they call it telescope here in a sec. But that's the symbol that lets me to know that I'm about to do a telescope warp. It's like a little arrow going to the left and right, and then a little, like, it almost looks like a trim bracket, but it just stands for telescope warp. And I'll take myself out of grid mode to make this really obvious. So I'll grab beat 2, and I'll move it. And I'm dragging beat 2 within the audio region to match beat 2 on the grid. And if you see what it's doing to the rest of the region, it's kind of like you're shrinking a telescope, you know, like you're pushing a telescope in or something like that. That's why they call it telescope warp. If I were to drag it to the right, it would telescope the region out. So I'm actually moving everything else in the region as I'm doing this. The whole thing is kind of, it's almost, you know, it's like a telescope, where the front of the region is pinned down, but everything else I can kind of pull out or push back in. Silly, but that's why they call it that. So I can make this guy be on beat 2. So I'll drag this beat 2 within the audio region. Now we can zoom in here and stick it on beat 2. And now I could put myself in grid mode for this too really easily and just snap it right there. Okay. So then what I would do, I could pin that guy down. Okay, there's I telescope warped that particular beat to be on the grid. And now I'm going to pin it down. So I double click on it and stick a warp marker right there. So let's listen. And as I listen through here, okay, this happens to be beat 3. Here's beat 3. If I can select it here, there you go. So I would want to move that to be on beat 3. Well, it just so happens that it already is. Now that you'll find once you start making things fit to the tempo, that once you do just a couple beats, everything else kind of falls into place. Particularly if the file was recorded to a click track, and this was. But if this was something like your project, your Lab 3, where it's something that wasn't recorded to a click and the tempo changes, you could sync it to the grid doing this kind of thing. So this just moves without affecting the sound of transients. So it affects the sound in that it's changing the tempo of the audio file, but as far as it's not affecting the pitch, and it's, at least to my ear at this point, not audibly affecting the timbre or the sound quality of the audio. So we're time stretching the audio around, yeah, kind of like it's a rubber band, and as long as we don't go too far with it, there's not going to be any serious sonic degradation as a result. So it does let me kind of move the transients around without having to cut them up, which is great. And again, I come here, and that guy's on beat 3, and I could go through this entire file and listen and find the beats and make sure that they match up with the grid. And I'm basically taking a file and locking it to the grid in Pro Tools. Really cool remix trick where, again, you can take an a cappella from like a Motown song from the 50s that wasn't done to a click track, and you can make it fit to a definitive click in Pro Tools and then put it over top of a beat or something like that. That's just a random example, but it totally, it works. Or take something like the sound of a train going by that obviously isn't at a set tempo and make it fit to a grid and use that as a music concrete kind of thing. There's a lot of abstract ways you can use this, but yeah. All right, cool. Now, the one thing I want you to note here is, watch what happens when I pin down, watch what happens when I put one of these warp markers in. Once a warp marker is down, I'm going to go telescope warp this beat 4 here. I'm just going to move it around, but I want you to pay attention to what happens to the audio in front of this particular warp marker at beat 3. This is really important, and it's the thing that gets people when they first use elastic time. It screwed me up initially with it. I'm moving this transient that's right around beat 4 back and forth, and you see how the audio that's in front of the preceding warp marker is not being affected. This stuff over here isn't getting moved around, okay? Once you stick an elastic audio marker on a track, it pins down everything preceding it. So in other words, it's like putting a push pin on our rubber band. If this is a rubber band, I just stuck a push pin into it. So when I move the stuff on the right around, it's not going to affect any of the stuff on the left, okay? And that's why as we move through this track and we get our beats down, I am putting warp markers in. We'll do it again. We'll go to the next beat here. So here. This guy should be at the beginning of measure 2. I'll move him to the beginning of measure 2, and I'll make sure there's a warp marker there. So then, now when I go telescope warp all this other stuff, it's not messing up all the work that I did to get this locked into the tempo, if that makes sense. And we're going to see more about this when we talk about range warping here, but that's called a telescope warp. It's the idea that when you move the position of the transient, it's moving everything else down the line at the same time, and it's typically used, again, not to beat this like a dead horse, to sync a file to the tempo of Pro Tools manually, as opposed to doing something like using the workspace or the conform to tempo feature that we looked at last week. So I use that one sometimes. All right, I'll be honest with you. I really only use that in a remix type scenario where I'm trying to tempo sync stuff up. I'll show you the one that you're going to use 9 times out of 10. It's coming. Now this next one, I have never used accordion warp. I'll show you what it is, but I personally, that doesn't mean it's not useful. I've just never used it before. If you with telescope warp, right, we had a point pinned in the timeline, and then everything else down the line was kind of telescoping in or out. Well, with accordion warp, it's a similar idea, except we're going to pin a point down in the middle of the region, and everything on either side of it is going to move out like an accordion around that point. If you think of like an accordion player playing an accordion like that. My hands look big. Interesting. So it's going to expand or compress audio equally on both sides of a fixed point inside the region. Instead of moving it just on one side like a telescope warp, it's going to move it on both sides around a fixed point. It is useful, I suppose, if the downbeat is in the middle of the region and you want to pin a certain point within that region at a certain point in the timeline, and you want everything else to move around it. That, I suppose, could work. And there's a special icon that's going to let us know that we're about to do an accordion warp, just like there was one that said telescope warp a minute ago. Right? For this to work, I want to make sure there's no warp markers at the beginning or the end of the region, because you'll see why here in a sec. Let's take a look at it. So I'm going to delete. Now this is a good thing here. I need to delete all the warp markers in this region. I want to get rid of all of them. I can just select the whole region and hit delete, and it will get rid of all the warp markers. It's not going to delete the region because we're not looking. The region is not what is at the top of our track selector view, or we're not looking at the waveform, we're looking at the warp markers. So if I hit delete, it's going to delete the warp markers. Just like if I was in volume view, it would delete my volume automation, it wouldn't actually delete the audio in the track. That's not what is at the top of the viewpoint of the track. So I digress. So I'll delete, get rid of them. It undid the warping too, you can see the audio went back. So let's look at what an accordion warp looks like. And I'm going to drag this file out a little bit so we can see this out in the track. And I'll just click on, let's see, solo this up here. This is maybe not the best example file to use for this, but like I said, I'm not somebody who uses this very often anyway. Like maybe, geez, we'll just do it. If I pin down this beat right here, say this beat, I want this beat right here is supposed to be, that's the downbeat, and I want that to be right at measure 4. So I'm going to put that beat right at measure 4. Now I'm going to cheat. It's kind of hard for me to kind of get this transient to sit right exactly at measure 4 unless I zoom in really close here. That's pretty close. If I really wanted that to lock to measure 4, think about this. Now, again, this is kind of a weird example, but just from what you know about Pro Tools, I'm trying to pin this particular transient right at measure 4. And I don't want to trim the region and lock it to measure 4. This might be a good use of our sync point. Remember we talked about sync points? I'm going to identify a sync point in this region, and remember it makes a point inside the region snap to the grid. So now I can snap this right to the grid by using a sync point. There you go. See, it locks right in. And I can get rid of the sync point if I want to. Again, just command, comma. Sync points can be really useful. It saves you some time editing. But There you go. So here's the accordion warp. I'll hover my mouse. Let's make sure we don't have any. Hold on one sec. Now remember, I said for accordion warp to work, the idea is it's going to time stretch both sides around this warp marker. So I put this warp marker here, but it doesn't seem to be letting me do it. It's not saying accordion warp right now. It's because, remember, I said you cannot have a warp marker at the beginning of the end of the region because we want the ends of the regions to move. And if it's pinned down with a warp marker, it ain't going to move. We know that that's what it does. It's like putting a push pin in it. Well, look at the beginning of this region. And this is another thing that might get you when you first use elastic time. You see that little blue half triangle right in the corner of this region? That is a warp marker. All right? The beginning of this region is pinned into the timeline and is not ever going to move when I start time stretching. And sometimes that's a really good thing. In this case, if you were doing the accordion warp, we don't want that. So I can just, this is another quirk of Pro Tools, so I'm glad this has come up. How do I get rid of that? How do I get rid of that warp marker at the beginning of this region? I can't double click on it. I can't option click on it. I'm holding down option and I'm not getting my mouse turning into a little minus pointer. Like, how do I get rid of it? There might be some magic way to do it, but I don't know what the hell it is, to be honest with you. If you right click, you can choose remove warp marker. Okay, that's the only way I know to get rid of it. I'm sure there's another way. I guess maybe, let's see, if we just swiped over it, could I swipe over and hit delete? Yeah, that works. Okay, there you go. Control click with option? I wish. Maybe you might be right. Here, let's see. Watch Fifi be right. No, it didn't work for me. Yeah, I think you just right click and get rid of it, or select over it. Like you can select over any warp marker and just delete it. But this accordion, again, accordion warp will not work if there is a marker at the beginning or the end of the region, because we want, again, the regions to move like an accordion. So check it out. See if it's going to, yeah, it's going to work now. So if I hover my mouse over this guy, oh, it did it again. Hold on one second. It's trying to be annoying. What happens is when I double click and put a warp marker in, it automatically puts a marker at the beginning of the region. It assumes that I want that. And I do most of the time. I'm just trying to demo this stupid accordion warp thing. All right, here we go. Accordion warp. Watch, see the symbol for it? So now the symbol, and this makes sense. The symbol is, again, the right and the left arrow again. We've seen that. But now instead of just having the little bracket on one side, which was the symbol for telescope warp, which lets us know that we're going to move one side of the region around. Now it's got the brackets on both sides, which lets me know that I'm going to be expanding or compressing both sides of the region. That's why it looks like that. And it's going to be moving it around that central warp marker that I have. So check it out. It's like an accordion. So I've pinned that one beat onto the timeline, and everything else is time stretching around that. Again, that's what it is. It's called an accordion warp. Sure. And I wish I should be able to give you a better example of when you would use that, but other than that you want to pin a certain beat down and have everything move around that, I'm not sure what else. I'm sure there's something, but I'm just not aware of it because I don't use it. So that's two. So we've talked about telescoping warp, we've talked about accordion warp, and here's the one that we use the most often. This is the one you use for pocketing, okay? It's called a range warp. I love me some range warp. And so this is going to let us move a warp marker around. And typically, though, this is only going to, we're going to define a range, and we're going to move a warp marker around inside of that range. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to pin one transient down, pin another transient down, and then move a warp marker in between those. So we'll set two warp markers and deal with the range in between. So we're not messing with the whole region like we've kind of been doing. We're only messing with a specific range. So I've got to have at least two warp markers present, pinned, so that I can manipulate the range in between them. This will make sense as we see it. And there's a special icon denoting that you're going to do a range warp, just like there is for the other two ones that we saw here. So check it out, and I'll give you the key command for this too. Dead freaking useful key command. So I'm going to delete all the warp markers here, and I'm going to move this back to the beginning of my session. So here's a range warp, and this is how I initially showed you guys how to use, demonstrated this. So watch. I'll pin a region down here, or pin a warp marker down. I'll come pin one down, let's say over here. Now I'm set up to do a range warp. because I have pinned these two guys down, and the range in between them I can now manipulate. Okay, so now I can come move this transient back and forth, but I'm not affecting the audio to the left over here, and I'm not affecting the audio over here. And the reason that we're able to deal with this range, right, is that we know that when we pin these guys down, they're like push pins on our rubber band. It's going to make this stuff over here safe, and it's not going to get warped as I drag this stuff around. All right, that's the concept you really have to start getting, is that warp markers, once you put it down, everything that happens before that marker is not going to be changed when you start messing with the audio after it. You'll have to use it, and it'll make more sense. This is, me talking about it's one thing, but you're just going to have to experiment with it. So I can, as I'm moving these transients around, I can move them around is a selection, so I can move multiple ones around, or I can move them around individually. I was just moving them around individually. I was grabbing one warp marker and moving it around, and you saw it, adjust. It's not that big of a deal. Well, what happens if I select multiple transients? Check it out. Let's kind of undo this here. So if I select multiple warp markers, and I'm selecting over them, all right? If I can actually do that here. Here we go. When I move them, they move together. You notice that it keeps the distance in between them the same. So they're just moving together as one marker here. Whereas if I do an individual one, right, it just moves that one back and forth. That makes sense. But yeah. Now think about this when it comes to pocketing. This is where this range warp thing becomes very, very useful. We could use let's look at back to our bass kick and snare drum here, because these guys are pathetically out of time, unfortunately. But let's look at a little section of this. We'll look at our kick, snare, and hi-hat, just as an example. And sure, I'm going to put myself in warp view. I'm in analysis, so I know that if I hold down Control, Command, and I have my edit insertion point in here, that I can go to warp view by going Control, Command, left, right arrow, like we talked about earlier. And let's look at how this performance is on the grid. Well, this drummer is habitually early, right? He played to a click track. This was played to a click, believe that or not. So here's the grid line where my edit cursor is, and you see that his transient is before that. Same thing here. Here's the grid line. His transient is before that. All right, he's early a lot. So what would we do normally to pocket this? Well, we might use Beat Detective, or we might manually go through and chop the transient up and move it, and then fill in the gap and all that kind of good stuff. That's great. Well, with Elastic Time, can't we just click and drag? Can't I just do this and then pull that and put it in time, put it on the grid? No cutting, no fading, no anything, right? Very, very quick to do that. I almost do almost all my drums in Elastic Time, unless there's some reason where I hear artifacting in the cymbals or something like that. But it's fast. But I made a mistake here. Watch what happens if I decide I'm going to put this one drum hit in time. What am I doing? I'm moving everything else in the timeline off. I'm moving everything. I don't want to do that. I just want to fix this one drum hit. So I'm doing a telescope warp right now when I probably don't want to be doing a telescope warp, meaning that I'm telescoping the rest of the file out. Not a good idea. This is where you might want to do a range warp. So maybe I would pin this beat down so that now when I move this beat, I'm not affecting everything else down in the timeline. And I can zoom in here, we can see our grid, and I can put this guy, here, right on beat 2, which is where it's supposed to be, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So I could go through this file and continue to do that, where he's off here. I could, click here, and I want to put him in time. Well, if I don't want to move everything else that might be in time out of time, I want to go ahead and pin the next region down as well. So, boy, when we talk about quantizing, that's when it gets really cool. But this is very convenient. If as long as it sounds good, it's good, Now, it does suck, though, that I have to constantly pin the next transient down before I move the transient before it, so I don't mess everything else up. Well, there's a key command that you got to know, because it just makes this so much faster, and it's very simple. So let's undo this. I'm going to do this again, but I'm using the key command. Watch what happens when I hold down Shift. Shift shows us the range warp icon. So I'm not pressing anything other than Shift right now. And you see how now, look at the picture. My mouse turns into two little, a left and a right arrow, and now we've got two little bars on either side. Guess what this is going to do? And I'm going to do it down here so you can really see. I'm going to do it right here. Watch what it does when I hold down Shift and I click to put a warp marker here. It's letting me know, hey, you're about to do an individual range warp. You're going to, boy, it's very instructive, isn't it? You're going to stretch audio relative to its neighbors. Check it out. I'll double click. Look what it just did. It put warp markers down all around this particular transient. So instead of me having to go manually enter those all in, which would suck, it just put them all in real quick. All right. Now, there's some caveats to this. You know, I'm going to let you guys experiment with this and see, you know, see if you like it, see if you don't like it. It works a lot of the time. There are certain phase things that will come up that we'll have to talk about. Yeah. So as I do this, I pin it down. I just held down Shift and clicked, and now I can move this guy. And you see how it moves just it. It doesn't move anything else down the timeline. Come down here. I'll hold down Shift, click. It enters in a whole bunch of them at once is the idea, all around to pin down the one that you want to move in the center. So it pins down a range and lets you do that. So it just saves you a lot of time. And thankfully, the little icon really shows you what's going to happen, where it's going to actually put one before where you're going to click, one after where you're going to click, and one right where you clicked, and then you can grab it and move it. So pretty slick. Yeah, and of course I'll do it again later. Now, another thing that will trip you up, just because I know the stuff, if you've never warped stuff before, you're going to run into a couple of issues. Here's an issue. It's a simple one, but it's easy to do. If you have the entire region selected and it's gray like it is now, and you try to warp something, it's not going to let you do it. This is going to happen to a lot of you guys, where you're going to be like, what in the hell? I saw him do this in the video, but when I go try to move something, it moves everything. It doesn't let me just individually move one transient. All right? This still happens to me, where I'm like, what is going on? You have to make sure that you don't have the whole region selected. Trust me, it's really easy to do. Now I can move this individual transient, but again, if everything's selected, it moves it all as one, and it does not work the way you would expect, and you're going to want to tear your hair out. So be aware of that. All right, but that's a range warp. We're warping a range of audio. Yeah. Cool. Now that's going to get us into some more stuff about. This is going to save you guys a lot of time when it comes to pocketing. So how did I get rid of? We already saw this. How to get rid of warp markers that you don't want. That was easy, right? You can option click, remember to get rid of them, or you can select over them and hit delete, and it undoes the warping and it deletes the warp marker. Cool. Well, there's also a feature that I really like, and I didn't know about this for a while, and I'm glad I discovered it, called Remove Warp. And you would think, this is under the region menu, okay? Just by the name of it, you would think that it does the same thing as us just deleting the warp markers, right? I mean, we delete a warp marker, the marker goes away, the audio goes back to where it was. So what is this remove warp option? What does it do differently than just hitting delete? Well, and I'll show you why I use this, but what it's going to do is it's going to remove the warping from the region. In other words, it's going to put all the transients back to where they're supposed to be, but it's going to leave the warp marker intact. All right? So watch this. It's pretty slick for pocketing purposes. The one thing I don't like about going through and manually pocketing stuff with elastic time is the fact that I have to constantly be adding in these stupid warp markers. Like even with the shift key command, it's still kind of annoying, especially if I know I'm going to be moving almost every beat around, right? If I'm only going to deal with a couple of beats in like a couple of the snare drum hits are off, okay, whatever, that's not a big deal. I'll come over to them, hold down shift click, move them around, fix it, done. But again, if I know I'm going to be dealing with the entire file, and sometimes with drums you do, I don't like to have to add all those markers in. So check this out. What I can do now, this is kind of just a workaround trick, but I'll show it to you. It'd be cool if I could just enter a bunch of markers in all at once. You know, if I could like pin them all down all at one time. And I don't think there's a way to see. Is there a way to do that? There's not. Boy, I wish there was. So how could we possibly do that? Well, we're going to get to talking about quantize. And I'm making the assumption that you guys talked about, everyone's had 4190, and therefore everyone knows what the concept of quantization is. We're not going to go back over MIDI quantization. Love it as I do, but It's the idea that you can select MIDI notes and quantize them, and those notes will snap kind of like magnets to certain grid values. You know what I mean? Like, so if I play a drum pattern and it's got a bunch of eighth note hi-hats and maybe the kick and the snare on quarter notes, if I quantize it to eighth notes, it's going to move all the drum beats to the nearest eighth note, right? And theoretically put it in time, which I may or may not want it to be perfectly in time, but I can choose to manipulate that stuff. Well, this is just a trick, okay? So this is not something you may even use, but just to show you how I do this, I want to pin all these markers down all at once, just so I can just go through and move them really quickly without having to worry about pinning them down myself. So I'm going to open up the quantize window. One of the real powers of Elastic Audio is the fact that we can quantize audio now. Think about it. What's the difference between this and MIDI? MIDI is just a bunch of notes that we know where they start, and so when we quantize, they can snap to a grid. Well, now we have denoted where all the transients in this audio start. We know where all the transients are. So why can't we just snap those to the grid? If we know the time stretching is going to occur, so it's still going to sound okay, and in fact, you can do that. So notice my quantize window here. Normally, we quantize MIDI from here, but because I have selected an audio file that has Elastic Audio on the tracks, see how it says Elastic Audio Events here? Okay? I can quantize my audio, and it's going to move my Elastic Audio events to the nearest grid value that I select, the same as quantizing MIDI. All right? So if I listen to this drum performance and I say, okay, he's playing, mostly playing hi-hat, or mostly playing quarter notes, but there's some eighth notes, hi-hat stuff, whatever, I would probably choose eighth notes. And I can hit apply, do that again. So I haven't done anything in this quantize window, literally, other than choose the grid. If he's playing, the rule about quantization, if you guys don't remember, or if you haven't had 4190 for some reason, is that you typically choose, for your quantize grid, the smallest rhythmic subdivision that the performer was playing. So if they're playing eighth notes, I probably want to choose an eighth note grid so that it properly places my eighth notes. Otherwise, it's not going to put them in the right spot. Right? If they're playing only quarter notes, choose quarter notes. That'll be fine. It's kind of a general rule. So in this case, the drummer's doing some eighth note stuff. He's not doing anything more complicated than that. If I hit the apply button, look what it does. It pins all my warp markers down at all the transients, and it moves them all onto the grid properly. I just took this drum part, and you can't really hear this, but I'll tell you that I know it works because this is a lab I'm going to have you guys do. And we just pocketed the entire drum track in about 2 seconds. All right. Now, is it going to be perfect? No, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a couple hits that'll mess up. If there's like a snare roll that he does, it may not treat that right. So what? I can go in and delete those warp markers using Option and make the snare roll go back to the way that it was. And if I feel I need to change it, I will. Otherwise, I'll just leave it. But this is a very, very quick way to pocket drums, and it works pretty good. Now, I don't typically pocket the entire track at once. I'll do it in like maybe 4-measure or 8-measure sections, because you may need, depending on what the drummer's doing, he may be playing different patterns in different portions of the song, so you may need to change your quantize grid. But yeah, super useful. Now, I kind of got into that a little bit. What I wanted to show you is if you're manually pocketing, and at this point you're probably like, why would I ever manually pocket stuff? But how can we pin all these warp markers down? Well, you notice when I hit apply, it pinned them all down. And I just want to show you what this remove warp guy does. What remove warp is going to do is it removes the warping or the stretching of the audio. It's going to put all the transients back to where they were, but it leaves the warp markers in place. So now I can really quickly go through a file and just grab the warp markers and move them around and lock it to. I could even put myself, if I really wanted to make everything perfect, I could put myself in grid mode and they would just snap right to the grid. Yeah, and it just saves me the step of having to actually go enter all the warp markers in, and put them down manually. So I use quantize. I don't even care what quantize is set to. I just use it to make all the warp markers appear, and then I remove the warping, and I'm left with my warp markers. So that's kind of maybe a little bit of an advanced thing. I don't know, but there you go. But that's what remove warp does. It only removes the warping. It doesn't remove the warp markers themselves. And trust me, you guys are going to have a lab where you work with this stuff. So quantizing. We may come back to more about quantizing here later. And I may save that whole process for another class. But be aware, experiment with it. You can quantize. If the audio is matching up with the click track and is close to it, So in other words, it's close to the grid. Experiment with using Quantize. You can get it there. I want to get into using groove templates, but we'll save that, like I said, for the lab, which is coming up next week. All right, so what I want to get to now is these different algorithms, because each one of these Elastic plugins has 4 or actually 5 different algorithms that you can choose from. And we talked about it a little bit, but as you're going to see, each algorithm has its own plugin window and its own individual settings that you have to know about. Now, it's not a lot of stuff, but it's important to get this to sound transparent, because what's the point of all this time stretching if it's audible that it's happening, right? There's some changes that we're going to need to make it work and be, so the listener doesn't hear that we've done something to manipulate the audio. So here is our Elastic Audio plugin types and the controls that are on them. And this will be, getting towards the end here. So the first one is called Polyphonic. It's the Polyphonic Elastic Audio algorithm. Oh, I'm frozen. Here, hold on one second. Is my screen frozen, Fifi? Or is the audio fine? Okay, cool. I know there's a lot of notes for today. Let me know if something, again, if it happens and you can't hear me or you don't see my screen updating. I can reset some stuff. Oh, good Lord. Yeah, I'm sure. They're going to be long. But that's the point of class, right? Take notes, learn crap. Should be MTSU's new motto. Take notes, learn crap. All right, I digress. Polyphonic. So our polyphonic algorithm, it is a general all-purpose algorithm. It's good for loops that have a lot of stuff, a lot of different timbres going on, a lot of different notes. Maybe you're dealing with you're doing a remix and you're dealing with a file that's got drums, bass, guitar. It's got a lot of instrumentation in it. This deals with that the best. So it's a good one to start with, unless you know for a fact that you're just dealing with drums and Rhythmic might be good for that. This one's kind of a catch-all. And a lot of times I'll start with Polyphonic and I'll change the other ones later just to kind of hear what they sound like. And we'll check that out. So good general time stretching algorithm. Now, it's got some settings that we have to look at. So if I put it on Polyphonic, all right, I've set my drums just for the sake of setting these drums to Polyphonic. We're not going to listen to it, but we're going to look at the plugin window that pops up. You get 2 options. Now, this plugin window is going to be different for each algorithm, and that's important. This plugin window is customized for these settings for each algorithm. This particular one, you see it says Polyphonic, and we only have 2 controls, so it's pretty simple. Though it is painfully vague in the manual about what these do, and you may not be able to hear it necessarily. So these aren't terribly important, but we have a follow button, and we have, more importantly, the window button. So here's what they do. The follow button simulates the acoustics of the original acoustics of the audio file. So as we're time stretching it, essentially, they've put this follow button to minimize artifacting. The idea is that it's going to try to make the time stretched audio file sound the same and have the same amplitude envelope as the original file. And I realize that that's vague. It's one of those things you just have to play around with, and you may not hear a difference a lot of the time. Okay. Again, I would be lying if I said that I went and pressed that follow button often and it made my track sound 10 times better. That's not the case. But it's there. I typically have it on. The next one is a little more important. The window setting. So this is kind of like a buffer. It's basically like how much of the audio is this algorithm going to analyze and deal with at once. And this is important as far as getting the best sound quality you can out of the plugin. And here's the general settings. Now, the general setting is to set it between 30 and 40 milliseconds. If you're dealing with drums or stuff that's very percussive that has very defined short transients, you want this to be shorter because we really want it to deal with, maintain the integrity of our transients, only deal with very short snippets of audio, so it's getting the transient and it's getting out and moving on very quickly. So we're only dealing with, again, 20 milliseconds or even less for a percussive type thing. And then for pads that don't really have a defined transient and are very long, you typically set it a little bit longer. It's going to keep your audio from sounding choppy, basically. If you set this right, it should sound transparent. If you're using the Polyphonic plugin and you start to hear like little chops in the audio, and that's one of the artifacts you'll hear when Elastic Audio isn't set properly, come mess with this window adjustment, and you should be able to get rid of that, so it'll be a little smoother. All right, that's really the practical use of this. If it doesn't sound good, come grab it. Typically, if it's percussive stuff, set it shorter. If it's legato stuff or pad type stuff, long drawn out notes, set it longer. There you go. And that's it. That's the only two options for Polyphonic: is follow, which is an envelope follower, and then window, which is again how many milliseconds of audio is the algorithm going to time stretch or deal with at a time. That's Polyphonic. Now monophonic. All right. This actually relates a little bit to tuning, interestingly enough. So one of the other algorithms is called monophonic, and this is best suited for things like vocals. All right. It's in monophonic instruments too. So bass, even though of course you can play more than one note on a bass, typically you're not. Things like flute, horns in instruments, particularly horns, they're monophonic instruments. This typically sounds better. It is the most processor intensive of the real-time algorithms. All right. It's because since it's designed to deal with things like vocals, it's treating the it's maintaining the format integrity of the file, and that takes some horsepower. That's what Melodyne does as well. So I've got a little definition here of formats. Formats are, and again, we looked at these in Melodyne, they're the distinguishing frequency components of either your human voice or an instrument, of a sound, okay? It's the spacing of the harmonics above whatever pitch is being played or sung. And that spacing never changes, all right? So it doesn't matter what note you sing, the relationship of the harmonics, they're what make up the timbre of your voice or of a guitar or whatever. We talked about this before. It's what makes, if I sing an A note and Felicia sings an A note, we're singing the same note, but we sound a little bit different. And it's all about our vocal tract and the size of our mouth and our nasal cavity and all that stuff that adds to the format characteristics of our particular sound. Well, when you are time stretching and pitch shifting, okay, you don't want those to change. You want that format integrity not to get screwed up, all right? And because if it does, the resulting sound of the instrument or the vocal is not natural. It doesn't sound true to what the original sound. You'll sound like a chipmunk, or you'll sound like your voice got lower or something weird like that. So that's the monophonic. The monophonic. Sorry, my cat's eating my computer right now. I'm hoping he doesn't unplug it. The monophonic algorithm maintains that format relationship. Okay, so it definitely sounds better, sounds good on vocals, better than polyphonic, and certainly better than rhythmic. It's going to make them sound more natural if you need time stretch vocals. But again, it also takes more horsepower from your computer. It takes a little bit longer to analyze the audio as well. So keep that in mind. But that's monophonic. There are no controls for monophonic. So if I put these guys in monophonic, let me go back to, there we go. There's no plugin controls for this. You see the little plugin window pops up, but there's nothing on it. So the next one is rhythmic, and we said that rhythmic is best suited for the for drums. Okay, so let's look at that, because there is a very important setting on the rhythmic guy. Pull up rhythmic, and there's just one thing going on here, and it's decay. Okay, so the way that rhythmic works is you can have a decay rate, which is the knob I'm grabbing right now, that it controls how quickly the transient decays after it's played. So decay rate is, if you think you're going to hear the drum hit, how long is the tail of that drum hit going to be? Okay, because as you're time stretching, think about that. You're stretching, you're elongating the transient, and especially the ring out of a drum in the case of this rhythmic guy. So you can actually mitigate that. You can set this low, and it basically means that it's going to let the transient through, and it's going to kind of fade it out. All right, so it's not going to let it have some really long, we'll say, ring to the drum, all right, or extended transient if you're time stretching. So the deal with this is if I turn this down, I can actually make, it can be an interesting sound on drums. I can make drums sound very choppy, where you hear the transient and then it's like it gets turned down before the next transient. So it starts to sound like you just, again, very choppy where you're turning down in between each transient, which you don't necessarily want. But keep in mind, if I were to take a drum loop and compress it and squish it together, I don't want a really long ring out of the drums. I may want it so it really fades after each transient very quickly, and I may need to turn this down to get it to sound natural if I'm really going to compress a hit together. The moral of the story is, if it doesn't sound good, come grab this guy. Typically, the only time I come use the decay knob is if my drums sound choppy. So it sounds like after the transients, the drum hits getting turned down too quickly before the next one comes in, and it sounds edited, if that makes sense. You might want to bring this decay right up. So again, that's kind of a practical explanation of when you want to use it. If the drums sound choppy as you're editing, you turn your decay up and you'll get more audio in between each transient so they don't sound that way. So yeah, and that's rhythmic. Oh my god, and we're on the last two. Varispeed. Varispeed's the easiest one. So the fourth guy, I don't know why algorithms are guys all of a sudden, but is Varispeed. And guess what this one does? So Varispeed takes us back to the day of linking time and pitch. So so far we've been stretching time stretching this stuff all over the place, and the pitch doesn't change. With Varispeed it does. So this is going to make this algorithm is similar to like what a record player would do, or what a tape player would do. So if I grab this drum loop and I stretch it, the pitch is going to get higher or lower. It's going to get lower, right? So the timing, I'm going to increase, the tempo is going to get slower, and the pitch is going to drop. If I squeeze the drum loop together, the tempo is going to go up, and the pitch is going to go up as well, okay? So we're now relinking those two things. There's no extra controls for Varispeed at all, but that's what it does. It's going to reattach pitch to tempo. Play around with it. Is it something I don't use it very often unless I'm doing like I need it for a special effect or something like that. But that's what it is. So, all right, now the big one. So far, every one of these that we've talked about, these four, they're in their own kind of little section right here, right? These have the option of being real time, we know that, or rendered, we know that too, right? I can set them depending on how I want to use it. If my computer processor can handle it, I'm just going to leave them in real time. So when I move something, I don't have to wait for it to render. I can just, keep rolling along. Well, now we have this fifth algorithm that is a rendered only algorithm. You don't get the choice of real time or rendered. It is going to render. If I choose this right now, Pro Tools is going to be rendering audio to my disk, and it takes a while, okay? So Xform is based on the Xform Audio Suite plugin, which is a time stretching audio suite plugin that you can buy for like $500, right? It's not cheap. And it's based on an algorithm, a time-stretching algorithm, a great one that's developed by the company iZotope, which you may have heard of, who put out like Ozone and iZotope RX and Stutter Edit and all these great plugins. Nectar, and that could go on. Yeah, there's a lot of them. If you haven't heard of them before, go check out their website. They're cheap and very excellent plugins. So anyway, so this is just another time-stretching algorithm, and it is not real time. And it's very processor intensive. So this is supposedly now the highest quality time stretching algorithm that you can use for Elastic Audio. So here's your typical workflow for this. And I'm going to go ahead and put it on the track. Now you're going to see what happens when I put this on the track. The math that it's doing is so much more in depth than the math that these four guys are doing that it's going to take, let's see here, see how long it takes to analyze. It's going to take a while to analyze this track. You see how the transients are all grayed out? I can't play these tracks right now because it's analyzing them. Let's look, remember our task manager? Let's look at our task manager and we'll see how long it's going to take Pro Tools to complete this task of analyzing these tracks using this, or time stretching them using this special algorithm. It's going to take for freaking ever, okay? So it is a significant difference in processing time, for sure. Like I'm talking about, this may take 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If you're doing like a 4-minute song and there's a bunch of drum tracks, it could take 20 or 30 minutes. So here is my workflow when it comes to using Xform. What I will typically do is I will use a real-time algorithm like Rhythmic, okay? And I'll do all my editing. If say we're talking about drums, right? Then when I've got everything sounding exactly the way that I want, I will then switch over to Xform and go get a cup of coffee or something like that while it renders out. The idea being in Xform should sound better. Now, you still need to listen to them and make sure that you think Xform sounds the best, but it almost always does. It particularly sounds better on high-frequency content. The thing you're going to notice about Elastic Audio, and people get discouraged about this, is you'll edit your drums with Elastic Time, and you're like, hey, Daniel said that this was going to sound great, and you'll be like, man, my cymbals sound like crap. Like, you'll hear your cymbals, they'll sound kind of artifacty and phasey and nasty. The way that you get rid of that is by using the Xform algorithm, okay? So just because it might not sound perfect when you're using the real-time algorithms, keep in mind that it's going to sound significantly better when you go to Xform. And that's why I think you should pretty much always go to Xform at the end, especially if you're doing something that has a lot of high-frequency content like cymbals, okay? You may not notice a huge difference on your kick drum, but hi-hats and things like that, it'll be very obvious. Vocals, it's pretty obvious as well, all right? So please keep that in mind. But it's going to take, you know, a while to render. So keep that in mind as well. Let's pull up the Xform plugin, all right? We got a couple of options on here, one of which is the quality. Well, if you're going to use Xform, why not just use the best quality? I don't get that. Now, if you don't have a lot of time, if I set it to lower quality, it'll render faster. We won't have to wait quite as long. But if we really care about, you know, what we're working on, you might as well go ahead. I've never done a low quality render before. You set it to maximum and just realize it's going to take some time. The other thing is this also has a way to a format option on it, but this is an actual button that you can press that will preserve the format shape of the audio, preventing it from any kind of artifacts. If you're doing pitch shift or anything like that, I usually just turn it on. But if it's things like drums, it's not such a big deal. It takes a little longer to render if you turn this format feature on. So if it's a vocal, if it's, you know, a horn, if it's a guitar, you may want to have that on. But if it's things like drums, that's kind of why they give you the option. That's not so important. It's not really going to ruin the sound of your drums, but it does add to the length of time it's going to take to process. Keep that in mind. Okay, we are just got a couple more of these guys, and we'll be about there. Yes. All right, cool. So, Elastic, how far can these Elastic Audio plugins time stretch stuff before they, you know, get us into trouble? Well, real-time processing allows you to take a file and shrink it to 1/4 of its size or expand it to 4 times longer than it actually was. Xform, again, because Xform is a higher quality algorithm, lets you go twice as far. Theoretically, I can make a file 1/8 as long or stretch it out to be 8 times as long. Now, that's a lot, right? I mean, how often do you need to take something and move it, time stretch it by 8 times? But the idea here is that if once you go, you can go beyond that. I can take a file and stretch it to be, with one of the real-time algorithms, make it be 5 times longer than it is. It'll let me do that, but it will turn the file red. You're all going to see this when you use Elastic Audio. I'll show it to you. The file's going to turn bright red, letting me know that Pro Tools can't guarantee the audio quality. I may get dropouts. I may get some pops. It's just not going to sound all that great. So I'm going to take Xform off here because, I don't want to wait forever for this to render. We'll go back to Rhythmic. And Rhythmic will render out, and let's look at the task manager. Look how fast Rhythmic's going to happen here. It'll be done here in a second. We'll snap up to here while doing this. All right, so here's the deal. We'll look at this guy. If I take something and I time stretch it too far, yeah. All right, cool. Thank you, Fifi. We went short last week. We'll go long this week. I know you guys don't mind. I just like to run my mouth. So check it out. I went too far. I'm way longer than 4 times as far as the amount of time stretching I just did. And there it is. It turns the region bright red. That's important. When you see that, you know it's probably not going to be all good. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm never going to grab it and time stretch it that far. Well, here's the reason that it turns it red. When you're using the quantize feature, all right, and you're having Pro Tools automatically do a bunch of time stretching, sometimes it will screw up and it will move things farther than they needed to be moved. And that red lets you know that something's wrong. You can look at a region and from first glance say, okay, it may have quantized most of the region right, but something's going on in this section because it's red. and you can go address that. Now you also should listen to it anyway, but it's just a visual indicator that something's not quite right, and you've exceeded what the range of elastic audio processing that they're saying is going to sound good. Okay. Now, as of Pro Tools 8, they released something else that has to do with elastic audio, and we looked at this earlier, but I kind of skipped over it and said we would come back to it. So not only do we have elastic audio, we have elastic pitch. All right. And this is a feature that we're going to see in the elastic properties window that lets us, that lets us pitch shift stuff. I don't use this a lot. It is handy to know that it exists because there is times where you're going to need this. And I'll come back to this page, but let's look at it. So I'm going to undo my crazy processing here. And I'll select my region, and I'll open up my elastic properties window. We said that is option 5, but here it is under the regions menu. And we looked at all this stuff already, but check out at the very bottom. See where it says pitch shift? I can pitch shift a region up or down by 24 semitones. And in your head right now, I know you're thinking, hey, 24 semitones, that's 2 octaves. You're right. So I have a range of 4 octaves I can go, 24 octaves up or down. Get back to 0 here with this guy. And I can also tune things in cents, right? We talked about, I think, in here, when we talk about tuning, a cents is a subdivision of a semitone. So there's 100 cents in a semitone. So it's a finer gradation of tuning. So for instance, pretend this is a guitar and one of the notes is off. One of the notes is a little flat, okay? I could select that note. Remember, because elastic properties is a region-based thing, I need to separate this region, and then I can pitch shift this. Let's say I wanted to, I don't want to change it by semitone here, unless I was doing a harmony. But maybe I want to, it's flat, I want to increase it by, 7 cents. So I'm going to raise it, put it in tune, all right? I use this with bass sometimes. If a bass player hits a flat note or maybe pushes the string too hard and it's a little sharp, I'll use this to kind of tune them. If you don't have Melodyne or something like that, this can be a kind of a similar, even though obviously it's not nearly as convenient, but you can do some basic tuning stuff with this. You can also mangle the crap out of drum files and stuff in a good way if you're into electronic music and you want to really mutilate drum beats or loops that you have. It can be kind of an interesting thing. But that's all it is. It's called elastic pitch. And when you pitch shift something, we'll pitch shift this file. I can remove it just like I can remove warp. Remember we had the region remove warp feature? I can remove pitch shift as well. So it will not change the warping of the audio. In other words, the time stretching, it will independently just remove any pitch shifting that I did if you're going to use that. So there you go. I can remove the pitch shift. And you see it got rid of the pitch shift just of this one region. Remember, this is region specific. So I could chop a drum loop up and pitch shift each beat differently if I really wanted to. There you go. And that, what I just said is exactly what's here. Now, the one thing is that is not available in monophonic mode. So if you put the monophonic algorithm on there, that pitch shift is not an option. It is for everything else, okay, but not for monophonic. So keep that in mind. If you want to do that, I get people who ask that, like, hey, you said you could do the pitch shift thing, and I put, the elastic audio algorithm on the track and couldn't do it. It wasn't an option. Well, it's because they had used the monophonic guy. What happens when I get rid of the elastic audio plugin? So I want to get rid of elastic audio. I want to take it off the track. Yeah, you hush. So check it out. When I remove elastic audio, it's going to give me 3 options. Because think about it. When you take the plugin off the track, what is it going to do? Is it going to get rid of all the warping that you did? Is it going to render it out and print a new audio file with the time stretched audio? How is that going to happen? So check it out. I come to this track, and I'm going to say, okay, we're done. Let's get rid of elastic audio. Let's disable it. Take it off the track. And as soon as I do that, it says, hey, just so you know, elastic audio regions cannot be maintained when disabling elastic audio. Well, no crap. If I take it off the track, it can't still be using elastic audio. I've removed the plugin. That's all it's saying. Do you want to commit the warped regions to disk? So commit, if I press the commit button, it is going to make a new region, render a new file in my audio files folder, okay, with the time stretching. Okay, so it's going to give me a new file with all the warping that I did. There you go, new region. Similar to like an Audio Suite plugin, what it does, or something like that. That's one option. If I really am taking it off the track because I'm not happy with the warping and I decide I don't want it anymore, I would hit revert. Revert will revert the file back to its original form before we did any warping whatsoever. Okay, it's going to get rid of everything like it never happened. So that's revert. So commit commits it, prints a new audio file. I free up processing power if I was using real-time algorithms because it's not stressing out my computer anymore to try to do all that time stretching in real time. It's one reason to take it off the track. Revert gets rid of it. Cancel just doesn't do anything. It takes me back to what I was doing. It's not going to affect anything. So the plugin's still on the track and time stretching is still going on. A lot of times what I will do is if I'm using a real-time one and I'm happy with the way that it sounds and maybe I'm going to send this session off to be mixed by somebody, I'll go ahead and just take Elastic Audio off the tracks and commit. So it prints, it's an audio file on the track. It doesn't matter if they have, if they're running Pro Tools 7.3 or something, they don't have Elastic Audio. So I want to make sure that those files are rendered and in place. And that's going to happen sometimes. Or maybe they're not even using Pro Tools and they're just going to want to, I don't know, OMF this out of this session into another session. I want to make sure that I've rendered it in place. So that's just an option. If your computer's bogged down, you could always just choose rendered processing, and then obviously it's not going to hog your computer's resources anymore. But you can also just remove it off the track completely. That's all that is. So just a couple other things. Oh, this is the last page. Oh my God. You'll get, if you're using region groups, I've said before, I love me some region groups. And you have a fade on your region group, you cannot use Elastic Audio. Is that going to really affect you a lot? No, but it's an error that you're going to get. So like if I'm using a region group, we'll use my drum tracks here again. Whatever, kick, snare, hi-hat, sure. And I'll select these guys, and I'm going to make a region group out of them. I could go to the region menu, right, and choose group, Command, Control G. Yay, we got a region group. I'll draw a big fade at the beginning of this, right? It's just fading all the tracks together. And then I'll try to manipulate Elastic Audio. It is not going to let me, all right? So it does not like fades on Elastic Audio or on tracks with region groups. Just be aware of that. Again, it's not anything all that important. It's just a quirk of Pro Tools. Now this one is a big deal, and maybe I should have said this right at the beginning. And I'm hoping that maybe in one of the updates to 9 this has been fixed, but as of very recently this was not fixed, and this is a huge problem. Okay, so again, perk that ears up. This is on page 886 of the manual. There's a little half of a page that talks about this feature. And here's page 886. So here's what Pro Tools is doing behind the scenes as you're doing Elastic Time. Because here's what's going to potentially happen to you. And again, hopefully this gets fixed and it's not anything we're going to think about. But when you are doing Elastic Audio on a track, Pro Tools is secretly putting what are called micro fades in between regions and in between fades and regions, but really in between region boundaries. It's putting these little micro fades in, which is great. Because without getting into the details, you can read the manual if you want to get into the details of it. Elastic Audio is creating some pops and clicks between region boundaries, right? And they get rid of that for us, which is awesome. They use these little micro fades. Hey, thanks. Here's the problem. If I come to kind of undo all the stuff that I did here. If I've got, let's say this is my drum track, okay, and I've got a couple different regions, and I'm using Elastic Audio on the track, and we'll just throw it back on just for the sake of having it on here. And I'm doing all my time stretching, and I'm pocketing, right? I'm pocketing everything, and I got everything right where I want, and it sounds great. I listen back to it, sounds fine, okay? And then I decide to go ahead and say, okay, I'm cool with it. Let's take Elastic Audio off the track, and when we do that, it's going to ask us, hey, do you want to commit? And I say commit. So basically, I'm rendering out my Elastic Audio processing, right? Which makes sense. That's a good, I mentioned that that's probably not a bad idea. Then you can listen back to your Elastic Audio tracks and hear pops and clicks. So my point is, when Elastic Audio is on the track, when the actual plugin is physically on the track, it sounds fine. But as soon as you take it off and it prints you a nice new audio file, then you go back and listen and you hear these pops and clicks and you're like, what in the hell is going on? It drove me insane on a project here not that long ago. Here's why. When Elastic Audio is on the track, I said Pro Tools is secretly drawing in these little micro fades to prevent any pops and clicks due to the Elastic Audio processing. Well, guess what happens when you take the plugin off and it renders a new file? It doesn't render out those fades, okay? So you'll end up with pops and clicks that you didn't hear while the plugin was on the track. That's a problem. So that happens in two scenarios. One, if you have regions in the track like this, all right, just separate regions, you'll hear pops and clicks at the boundaries when you shouldn't. The other thing will be if you have fades. So if you have a fade on the track, you'll potentially hear a click where the fade is, which is also very weird. You wouldn't expect that to happen. So I said it 5 times before. Hopefully this is something that is we don't have to worry about in, maybe even in the latest update of Pro Tools. I'm just warning you about it. Yeah, it's weird. And just be aware, if something like that happens, come back to this video or check your notes and be like, oh, Roland said to do this to get away from that. Here's a way to get around that happening. And I've just made this part of my workflow so I don't ever have to freaking deal with it or think about it. Before I go Pocket with Elastic Time, I will typically just consolidate the whole track. So if I know that I'm going to come in with Elastic Audio and I'm going to go through and pocket this track, I'll just make a duplicate playlist, right? And I will consolidate the entire track into one audio file. You don't have any problems if you do that. Where you run into issues is when regions are butted up together, right? Or we have fades drawn in the track. And if we render, right, what's it going to do? At least in Pro Tools 9, it's going to print all the fades as part of that big new audio file, and you're cool. So if you ever have that issue, be aware that that's the way around that, all right? I just wanted to point that out because I got some emails from some even some like, multi-platinum dudes who hit me up and were like, what the hell is going on? I was like, I don't know either. And we kind of researched it down and, figured out that that's what it was. It's bizarre, but microfades. So, yeah, hopefully they've sorted that, but just pointed out to you. Oh my lord. Okay, guess what? I think we're good. We'll talk about groove templates and stuff later in relation to Elastic Audio, so we're not totally done with Elastic Time, but I tell you what, we just covered almost everything there is to possibly know about it. Now, using it is a different story, so I really encourage you guys to just load up some drum loops and just screw them up. That's the best way to use it. Yeah, of course you're going to want to pocket with it and stuff, but just kind of get a feel for what it does when you move a warp marker. How does it affect other parts of the file? Yeah, I think it'll help the cause.